The desert wind carried death across the New Mexico wasteland, its howl cutting through Emma Rose Whitlow's soul as she stumbled through pre-dawn darkness that seemed to swallow hope itself. Her bare feet lacerated by razor-sharp stones painted crimson signatures in alkali dust that the merciless grit erased before her next desperate step. Behind her, the thunder of pursuit grew inexorably louder. 4 horses at full gallop, their riders whooping like demons summoned from the deepest circles of hell. There by them rocks. Dirty Dan Reardon's voice split the night like a whip crack. His rifle spoke with metallic authority, the bullet's passage so close to Emma's ear that she felt its heat sear her skin. She dove sideways, her body rolling behind a boulder, while 2 more shots exploded stone fragments that drew blood from her cheek like tiny, vindictive claws. At 20 years old, Emma bore scars that would have broken spirits twice her age. 6 weeks of captivity in Cornelius Voss's trafficking empire had taught her truths about human cruelty that no young woman should ever learn. She would embrace death in this godforsaken wasteland before returning to those rooms above the saloon, where girls vanished like smoke, leaving behind only the echo of screams and the stench of despair. Fan out, cut her off. Dan's command carried the casual authority of a man accustomed to hunting human prey. Emma pressed her spine against the boulder, its surface still radiating warmth from yesterday's punishing sun. Her heart hammered against her ribs with such violence she feared it might shatter. Dawn was approaching fast across the eastern mountains, and with it would come the pitiless exposure that meant certain recapture. A shadow detached itself from the starlight, tall, lean, moving with the fluid grace of a predator who belonged to this harsh country, like the sagebrush belonged to stone. He wore a wide-brimmed hat that concealed his features but carried himself with an authority that spoke of survival earned through blood and wisdom. This way. Quiet now. The voice was barely a whisper, yet it resonated with absolute command. Emma turned to find a man kneeling beside her sanctuary, his face half lost in darkness. What she could discern revealed weathered bronze skin stretched over high cheekbones and eyes that cataloged every detail of their perilous situation with predatory precision. "Who?" "Chato. You're running from Voss's operation." His gaze never ceased its restless scanning of the night. 3 armed men quarter-mile back and closing fast. When they find us, we move like our lives depend on it, because they do. "Can you ride bareback?" Emma thought of her father's horses from before the mining accident that had supposedly claimed his life before the orphanage, where Voss's recruiters had found her like wolves scenting wounded prey. "I can try. I can." Trying gets you shot dead. No judgment colored his words, merely frontier honesty stated as immutable fact. Either you can ride or you cannot. There's no middle ground in what's coming. Something in his unflinching directness reached past the terror that had been her constant companion for weeks, uncounted. Despite exhaustion and soul-deep fear, she straightened, finding within herself reserves she'd forgotten she possessed. "I can ride." Chato studied her face in the starlight, his expression unreadable as carved stone. Then he nodded, once a gesture that somehow conveyed both acceptance and grim approval. "Good. Stay close to me and—" The thunder of hoofbeats erupted closer, accompanied by the sharp crack of rifles. A bullet struck stone mere inches from Emma's head, its impact showering them both with stinging fragments as Chato's strong hand closed around her arm. "Move 'em." They ran toward a cluster of rotting buildings that had once served travelers on the old freight road, skeletal remains of human ambition surrendered to the desert's patient hunger. Most structures had collapsed under decades of neglect, but one maintained walls and roof enough to offer temporary sanctuary. They slipped inside just as the first drops of rain began to fall, transforming dust to mud and filling the air with the clean, sharp scent of creosote. Through gaps in warped boards, Emma watched their pursuers spread out in methodical search patterns. Her wrists bore the phantom ache of iron shackles, vivid reminders of weeks spent chained like livestock in Voss's carefully organized hell. "Check every building." Dan's voice carried with crystalline clarity through the thin air. "Girl can't have gotten far on foot in this country." Boots scraped across the threshold of their hiding place, accompanied by the ominous metallic click of a hammer being drawn back. Emma held her breath until her lungs burned like fire, watching those boots pivot with deliberate menace as their owners searched the abandoned interior. Lightning suddenly illuminated the night, like God's own fury revealing Emma's pale face for one terrifying heartbeat. Thunder crashed immediately afterward, shaking dust from the rafters and making the entire structure groan with the voice of approaching ruin. The boots retreated, accompanied by muttered curses that faded toward the next building in line. "They'll be back." Chato said, his voice barely audible above the storm's growing symphony. "This country offers no real concealment, and they know every water source between here and the Mexican border." Emma wrapped her arms around herself, fighting tremors that had nothing to do with desert cold and everything to do with the abyss of hopelessness that threatened to swallow her whole. "I have nothing left to offer anyone. No money, no family who would search for me. I have 2 daughters." Chato interrupted, his words chosen with the same precision he might use to select ammunition. 8 and 5 years old. Their mother died of lung fever 2 winters past. He paused, studying her face in the intermittent lightning. "They need someone who understands a woman's heart. You need a place where you can belong to something good again." The offer hung between them like gun smoke, heavy with implications neither fully comprehended. Emma stared through the gloom, trying to read intentions and features that revealed nothing of the man's inner thoughts. "You're asking me to become mother to your children in exchange for protection from men who want to drag me back to hell. Food, shelter, safety. A place to call home where no one owns you." His voice remained steady as granite bedrock. "In return, you help raise Alope and Dateste. Teach them what their mother would have taught them about being strong women in a world that tries to break strength." Emma thought about the riders searching in the darkness, about limping Luke Morrison's tobacco-stained leer, and Voss's calculating coldness that treated human beings like inventory to be bought and sold. This stranger offered something she hadn't dared hope for since childhood, the chance to be more than prey, more than merchandise, more than a commodity with an expiration date. What kind of life would it be? Hard, honest, sometimes dangerous. His voice carried no false promises, no romantic illusions, but free. Nobody owns you, sells you, treats you like cattle to be moved from market to market. Emma closed her eyes, feeling something fundamental shift inside her chest, like tectonic plates finding new alignment after an earthquake. When she opened them again, her voice carried quiet determination. "I'll earn my place whatever it takes." Chato led her to a lean-to, where 2 horses waited a sturdy dun gelding and a smaller mare, both standing with the patient endurance of animals who understood survival in harsh country. He helped her mount with hands that conveyed strength without force, his touch careful and respectful in a way she'd almost forgotten was possible between men and women. They rode into the storm while lightning split the sky like God's judgment, and thunder masked the sound of hoofbeats on stone. Emma clung to her horse's mane, trusting the animal's instincts to follow Chato's mount through terrain invisible in the absolute darkness. Behind them, angry voices gradually faded into storm noise, and by morning, the rain would wash away their tracks as completely as if they'd never existed. Dawn broke gray and cold over vast red rock country that stretched endlessly toward purple mountains standing sentinel on the horizon. They rode toward a cluster of buildings nestled against a green ribbon where water flowed between ancient oaks, and the sight of it filling Emma with something she'd almost forgotten existed in the world hope. Riven Oak, Chato said, indicating the settlement spread below them like a child's toy village. Railroad comes through twice weekly when the weather permits. Maybe 70 souls when everyone's sober and not hiding from their past. Emma studied the town's sun-bleached buildings, arranged around a main street that would become a river of mud with the first serious rain. But smoke rose from chimneys in gray plumes, and people were beginning to stir with morning routines that spoke of ordinary lives being lived despite the harsh country. The simple business of survival starting another day. Who there can we trust with our lives? Dr. Theodore Pike runs the clinic white building with the A hand-painted shingle reading physician and surgeon fixed upon the door. Lost his leg to gangrene during the war, but his medical skills stayed sharp as a surgeon's blade. Treats anyone who pays fair and asks no questions that don't concern healing. Through the clinic window, Emma glimpsed a man with graying hair and a pronounced limp arranging supplies with the methodical precision of someone who understood that organization often meant the difference between life and death. Catherine Dale teaches school. Chato continued pointing to a larger building distinguished by actual glass windows. From St. Louis, originally before something drove her west. Keeps a Derringer in her desk drawer and knows how to use it with deadly accuracy. And our enemies. Chato's expression hardened like cooling iron, all warmth draining from his features. Cornelius Voss owns the freight company, half the cattle in 3 counties, and most of the men who make decisions that matter around here. His enforcers include Dan Reardon. You've had the pleasure, and one-eyed Sam McKenzie, who can shoot playing cards in half at 200 yards. They reached Chato's homestead as the sun climbed above eastern hills, painting the landscape in shades of gold and amber that transformed harsh country into something approaching beautiful. The property was modest, but maintained with obvious care. 2 ancient oaks, providing merciful shade for a pole corral. A traditional Apache wickiup standing beside a log cabin, and a vegetable garden, protected by brush fencing against the depredations of rabbits and deer. 2 girls emerged from the cabin, and Emma's breath caught in her throat like a physical thing. The older one, Alope, had inherited her father's high cheekbones and intelligent alertness. She wore a calico dress decorated with intricate beadwork at the sleeves, her long black hair braided with colorful ribbons that caught the morning light like captured flames. Docteste peered from behind her sister's protective skirts, thumb firmly planted in her mouth and a corn-husk doll clutched in her free hand. Her dark eyes held the profound wariness of a child who'd learned that adults could disappear without warning, leaving behind only absence and unanswered questions. Emma dismounted with careful deliberation and knelt in the dust, holding out her empty hands, palm up, in the universal gesture of peaceful intent. The gesture felt important, ritualistic somehow, a declaration that she came not as conqueror, but as supplicant. "Hello," she said, keeping her voice gentle as summer rain. "I'm Emma. Your father has invited me to stay with your family for a while." Alope stepped forward with the devastating directness that only 8-year-olds possessed, studying Emma's face with unblinking intensity. "Are you going to leave, like all the others did?" The question struck Emma like a physical blow, revealing depths of abandonment these children had already experienced in their brief lives. She glanced at Chato, who was unsaddling his horse with meticulous attention to details that didn't require such focus, clearly uncomfortable with the emotional territory his daughter had just opened. "I don't know about the others," Emma answered with complete honesty, understanding instinctively that anything less would be detected and rejected. "But I promise you this, I won't disappear without saying goodbye first. You'll always know where I am and why I'm going if I ever do." It wasn't much of a promise, but it was real and specific rather than the vague reassurances adults usually offered children. Teste emerged from her hiding place behind a lope and studied Emma with the intense focus only very young children could maintain. After a moment that felt like an eternity, she extended her doll, not offering it exactly, but displaying it as some kind of test. "Her name's Corn Sister," Teste whispered around her thumb. "I made her all by myself with these hands." "She's beautiful," Emma said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. The doll was crude by city standards, but it radiated the love and care that had gone into its creation. "Did someone teach you the skill?" A small smile crossed the child's face, like sunrise breaking through storm clouds. "Mama showed me before she went to the spirit world to be with the ancestors. She said Corn Sister would keep me company when the loneliness got too heavy to carry alone." Emma's throat tightened with unexpected emotion. These children had lost their mother, endured the parade of temporary caretakers, and were now being asked to trust yet another stranger who might vanish as suddenly as she'd appeared. The courage it took for them to remain open to connection, despite such experiences, humbled her completely. The morning passed in learning routines that would become the foundation of their shared existence. Emma helped prepare jerky for winter storage, her hands following half-remembered motions from childhood, as she cut and seasoned the meat with herbs that scented the air with promise. In the cook shed, she assisted with rendering fat for soap making and brewing willow bark tea for Chato's recurring shoulder pain, working beside him with increasing comfort as the hours melted away. When he demonstrated the homestead rifle's operation, their hands brushed during the safety inspection. His palms were calloused from years of honest labor, fingers steady and sure as he guided her grip into proper position. The contact sent warmth flowing up her arms that had nothing to do with the day's heat and everything to do with the gradual thawing of her frozen heart. "Squeeze gentle, don't jerk the trigger," he instructed, his voice patient as a teacher with a promising student. "Let the shot surprise you when it comes like truth emerging from darkness." Emma felt herself responding to his nearness in ways that both thrilled and terrified her. After weeks of brutal captivity, where men's touch meant only pain and degradation, Chato's careful respectfulness was like water to someone dying of thirst. That afternoon, clouds gathered over distant mountains like an approaching army of shadows. As rain began to fall in earnest, they huddled under a wool blanket in the cabin's main room, watching the storm through the single window while the children pressed close to Emma's sides with unconscious trust. Their small bodies radiated warmth against her ribs, and without conscious thought, she found herself stroking Alope's silky hair, while listening to their quiet chatter about dolls and horses and the profound mysteries of adult behavior. The simple intimacy of it being needed, being trusted, being part of something larger than her own survival, nearly overwhelmed her with its unexpected sweetness. "Tell us about where you came from," Teste whispered, her thumb temporarily abandoned in favor of curiosity. Emma looked out at rain, hammering the dust into temporary submission, each drop carrying the scent of renewal and possibility. "I came from a place with too many people and not enough sky, where girls like me weren't allowed to choose their own paths or decide their own destinies." "Did you have children there?" Alope asked with a directness that seemed to be a family trait. "I cared for children who had no parents, but they weren't mine the way you belonged to your father. They were just temporary responsibilities that came and went like seasons." Chato shifted beside her, his shoulder brushing hers, as he adjusted the blanket to cover them all more completely. The contact was brief, but electric sending awareness crackling between them like lightning seeking ground. "And now," Emma looked down at the two girls, then back at him, seeing something in his dark eyes that made her pulse quicken with possibilities she didn't dare name. Now I'm learning what family really means when it's built on choice rather than blood alone. The storm intensified as evening approached, but inside the cabin, warmth and quiet conversation created a sanctuary that made the weather seem like a distant concern. When the children finally surrendered to sleep, Emma found herself alone with Chato by the dying fire, the silence between them comfortable rather than awkward. He cleaned his rifle with methodical care that spoke of long habit while she mended a tear in Da Testa's favorite dress. The domestic normalcy felt almost surreal after weeks of terror and uncertainty, like stepping into someone else's life, someone who deserved peace and gentle evenings by the fire. "Thank you," she said quietly, not looking up from her needlework. "For what?" "For seeing me as more than just another mouth to feed or another pair of hands to lighten your burden. For giving me a chance to be useful instead of just grateful." Chato set down his weapon and studied her face in the flickering firelight, noting how the flames brought out gold highlights in her brown hair. It made her skin glow with warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. "You broke free from men who would have destroyed you piece by piece, then walked into the desert, rather than surrender what was left of your soul. That takes a rare kind of strength. My daughters need to see that such courage exists in the world." Outside, the storm raged with increasing fury. But inside, Emma felt something she'd almost forgotten could exist: the possibility of belonging somewhere, of building something lasting with people who valued her for her heart and mind, rather than just her youth and vulnerability. Over the following weeks, their unusual family began to find its rhythm like musicians learning to play together. Emma rose before dawn to help with chores that would have seemed impossible during her pampered childhood, her hands growing calloused from hauling water and chopping wood. She taught the girls to read, using Catherine's borrowed primers, while they instructed her in the intricate protocols of childhood games and the proper care of corn-husk dolls. Chato worked his small herd of cattle with the patience of someone who understood that lasting prosperity came from careful stewardship rather than quick exploitation. Emma often watched him from the cabin door, noting the gentle way he handled even the most stubborn animals and the quiet authority that made them respect his commands. There was something deeply attractive about a man who possessed strength but chose gentleness, who could be hard as iron when necessary, but preferred solutions that honored life. Dr. Theodore Pike became a regular visitor, his medical knowledge invaluable in a place where the nearest hospital was 3 days hard riding through country that could kill the unwary. He was a scholarly man in his 50s, with iron-gray hair and intelligent eyes that missed little. His war injury had left him with a pronounced limp, but his hands remained steady as a surgeon's when treating injuries or delivering babies into a harsh world. "You have natural instincts with wounds," he told Emma one afternoon, as they tended a rancher's infected cut that could have turned fatal without proper care. "Have you considered learning more formal medical training? The territory's growing fast, and we need people with both skill and compassion." Emma felt a flush of pride that warmed her more than the afternoon sun. In Voss's world, women were valued only for their physical attributes and their capacity to generate profit. Here, her intelligence and empathy were seen as precious resources rather than irrelevant complications. Catherine Dale proved to be a formidable ally despite her deceptively refined appearance. The schoolteacher had arrived from St. Louis with a trunk full of books and iron determination to bring education to frontier children who might otherwise grow up unable to read their own names. She was perhaps 30 years old, with auburn hair always perfectly arranged and clothing that somehow remained crisp despite the desert's best efforts to reduce everything to dust. "I've been tracking unusual freight movements through town," Catherine mentioned casually one evening as she shared dinner with Emma's growing family. Her tone was conversational, but her eyes held the sharp awareness of someone who noticed patterns others missed. Wagons that arrive empty under cover of darkness, but leave heavily loaded, never carrying anything that appears on territorial shipping manifests. Emma's blood turned to ice water in her veins. She recognized the pattern from her own terrible experience, the careful scheduling, the secrecy, the armed escorts that suggested cargo more valuable and dangerous than ordinary merchandise. What kind of loads? Difficult to say with certainty. Always at night, always with armed guards, always heading toward mining country where questions aren't welcome. Catherine's eyes were sharp with suspicion that went beyond mere curiosity. But I've heard voices from those wagons during their brief stops. Women's voices speaking languages that aren't English or Spanish. The knowledge settled in Emma's stomach like a cold stone, heavy with implications that made her feel physically sick. Voss's operation was continuing, bringing in fresh victims to replace those who'd been sold, used up, or simply disposed of when they became troublesome. Somewhere in the darkness, that other women were experiencing the same terror she'd endured, praying for rescue that might never come. Lewis Hart emerged as another frequent visitor, his farm bordering Chatto's grazing land, where their cattle sometimes mingled near the creek that provided life to both properties. He was a solid man in his early 40s, with the weathered hands of someone who'd spent his life coaxing reluctant crops from stubborn soil. His wife had died in childbirth 3 years earlier, leaving him to raise 2 young sons alone, while managing a homestead that demanded more work than one person could reasonably provide. I've been thinking about pooling resources for winter feed. Hart suggested one evening as they shared coffee on Chatto's porch, watching the sun paint western mountains in shades of gold and crimson. My hayfield's your grazing knowledge. Maybe we could both come out ahead when the snows come calling. It was a sensible proposal born of frontier practicality, and Chatto agreed readily. Cooperation between neighbors often meant the difference between prosperity and catastrophe in country that showed no mercy to the unprepared. But Emma noticed something in Hart's manner, a nervous energy that seemed at odds with his usual steady demeanor, a tendency to ask detailed questions about their daily routines, their planned trips to town, their relationships with other ranchers in the area. The curiosity seemed natural enough from a neighbor seeking to build community ties. But something about it triggered warning bells in Emma's mind. She tried to dismiss the feeling as residual paranoia from her traumatic experience. After weeks of captivity, where every stranger could be an enemy, it was natural to see potential threats everywhere. As autumn deepened into winter, Emma found herself settling into routines that felt increasingly natural, like clothes that had been tailored specifically for her body. She helped Alope with arithmetic, while Dateste practiced writing letters in the sand, with a stick her tongue poking out in concentration. She learned to make soap from rendered fat and lye, to preserve vegetables in sealed jars, to recognize the subtle signs that predicted weather changes days in advance. Most importantly, she began to understand the complex dynamics of her relationship with Chatto. He was unfailingly respectful, never presuming intimacy beyond what their practical arrangement required. But there were moments when their hands touched while working together. When she caught him watching her with expressions he quickly concealed, when he unconsciously positioned himself between her and any potential danger that suggested deeper feelings developing beneath the surface, like underground rivers flowing toward an inevitable joining. One evening, in late November, as they sat by the fire, while the children slept peacefully in their beds, Emma found courage to broach the subject that had been weighing on her mind like an unspoken prayer. "What was she like?" she asked quietly, her voice barely audible above the crackling flames. "Your wife." Chatto was silent for so long that Emma wondered if he'd chosen not to answer, if the subject was too painful to discuss with someone who was in many ways still a stranger. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the careful tone of someone handling precious, fragile memories that could shatter at the slightest mishandling. Ayana was light itself given human form, She could find something to laugh about, even in the hardest times, could make the darkest days seem bright just by existing in them. The girls inherited their curiosity from her, their stubbornness too. A ghost of a smile crossed his features like sunrise touching mountaintops. She died fighting to bring Da Teste into this world, and with her last breath she made me promise to teach both daughters that being strong doesn't mean being hard, that gentleness is not weakness, but the highest form of courage. Emma felt tears threatening at the love and devastating loss in his voice. She could hear how deeply he'd loved his wife, how her death had torn a hole in his world that nothing could ever completely fill. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have asked." "She would have liked you," Chato said, looking directly at Emma for the first time during the conversation. His eyes held depths of emotion that made her breath catch. She always believed people could change, could become better than their circumstances tried to make them. She would have seen the strength in you, that I see the kindness that survived everything they tried to do to destroy it. The comment hung between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross, heavy with implications that could change everything. Emma felt her heart racing as she met his gaze, seeing something there that made her simultaneously terrified and hopeful. "Chato, Papa Da Teste's sleepy voice interrupted from the doorway, her corn-husk doll clutched against her chest. "I had a bad dream about shadows with teeth. Can Emma tell me a story to chase them away?" The moment dissolved like morning mist, but its memory lingered as Emma tucked the little girl back into bed and spun a tale about brave princesses and gentle dragons who protected children from nightmares. When she returned to the main room, Chato had banked the fire and retreated to his own sleeping area, leaving her with the sense that something important had been spoken, without words acknowledged, without declaration. Winter brought its own challenges and unexpected revelations. The first serious snowfall trapped them inside for 3 days, forcing the family to rely completely on each other for entertainment and comfort. Emma discovered that Chato possessed a remarkable singing voice, rich and warm as aged whiskey, as he performed traditional Apache songs that filled the cabin with haunting melodies that seemed to speak directly to her soul. The girls taught her complex hand games that required quick reflexes and quicker thinking, laughing delightedly when she fumbled the intricate patterns. During those long, quiet evenings, with wind howling around the cabin's corners like lost spirits, Emma began to share fragments of her own story. Not the brutal details of her captivity; those wounds were still too raw and dangerous for children to hear. But earlier memories of her father's kindness, her mother's death when Emma was barely older than a Lopi, the crushing loneliness of the orphanage where she'd waited years for someone to claim her. "Your papa sounds like he was a good man," Alope said one night as they lay in their shared bed, listening to wind testing the cabin's strength with invisible hands. "He was the best man I ever knew." Emma agreed, feeling the familiar ache of loss and love intertwined like golden threads in a tapestry of memory. "I think he would have liked your papa too." They both understood what it means to protect people who can't protect themselves. Maybe they can be friends in the spirit world, Da Teste suggested with 5-year-old logic that made perfect sense in its own innocent way. Maybe they're watching over all of us together. As winter gradually released its grip on the high desert country, Emma began to notice changes in herself that went far beyond the obvious improvements in her physical health. The hollow, haunted look in her eyes was filling in with something brighter and more hopeful. Her hands, once soft from captivity's enforced idleness, had grown strong and capable from honest work. Most importantly, the constant fear that had lived in her chest like a caged animal was slowly being replaced by something she'd almost forgotten could exist: genuine hope for the future. But that hope was tested to its breaking point one cold March evening when everything began to unravel. Hart arrived just after sunset, his usually steady demeanor replaced by obvious agitation that set every alarm bell in Emma's mind clanging with urgent warning. He declined coffee with shaking hands, his eyes refusing to meet anyone's directly, as he delivered news that made Emma's blood turn to ice. "Saw something troubling today up Thunder Creek Way," he said, his voice carrying false casualness that didn't fool anyone present. "Was checking my north fence line when I heard voices from the old mining operations. Women's voices speaking what sounded like German or maybe Polish." Emma's cup rattled against her saucer with the violence of her sudden trembling. "How many voices?" "Hard to say for certain from my distance. At least 3, maybe more." Hart's face was grave with what appeared to be genuine concern. But something in his manner struck Emma as performative, like an actor reciting lines. One of them was crying something terrible. Another kept calling out what might have been names Maria Rosa, something like that. Chato set down his own cup with the careful precision of a man controlling strong emotions. "You see any guards posted?" 2 men with rifles that I could spot, maybe more, I missed. They had horses picketed nearby in good grass, looked like they were planning to stay for a while. Hart paused, seeming to wrestle with some internal decision. "Folks in town are saying there's been more freight traffic lately. Always at night, always with armed escorts that don't look like ordinary teamsters." Emma felt the familiar knot of terror forming in her stomach. But this time, it was accompanied by something new, an infinitely more dangerous rage that burned like forge fire in her chest. Voss was continuing his operations, bringing in fresh victims, while she lived in safety with her new family. The knowledge was unbearable. "We have to do something." She said the words emerging with quiet intensity that surprised everyone present, including herself. "We..." Chato's voice carried a warning tone that any sensible person would heed. "You're safe here, Emma. There's no reason to put yourself back in that kind of danger. There is every reason in the world." Emma stood pacing to the window, where she could see the girls playing in the yard, with the unconscious joy of children who felt perfectly secure. "Those women are exactly where I was 6 months ago. Terrified alone, praying that someone somewhere will care enough to help them before it's too late." Dr. Pike had arrived during their conversation, his medical bag in one hand and walking stick in the other. He'd overheard enough to understand the situation's gravity, his weathered face growing increasingly grim as Hart repeated his report. "If Lewis is right about what he observed, this constitutes a federal matter," Pike said, settling his bag on the table with clinical precision. "Kidnapping and the unlawful transport of women across territorial lines falls squarely under martial jurisdiction, not local law enforcement that might be compromised." "Problem is," Hart interjected with what seemed like helpful concern, "nearest federal marshal is probably in Santa Fe, 3 days hard riding if the weather holds and the roads stay passable. By the time we could get word to him and he could organize a proper response, those women could be shipped anywhere from California to Mexico." Emma looked around the room at these good people grappling with an impossible situation. They all wanted to help, she could see it in their faces, but the risks were enormous and the odds of success uncertain at best. The weight of moral responsibility settled on all their shoulders like lead blankets. "What if we didn't wait for official help?" she said quietly, giving voice to the thought that had been growing in her mind like a dangerous plant. The silence that followed her suggestion was heavy with implications that could get them all killed. What she was proposing was dangerous, beyond measure. A handful of ranchers and townsfolk taking on Voss's entire organization without legal authority or military backup. "Emma," Chato said carefully, his voice carrying all the weight of a man who'd seen too much violence. "You don't fully understand what you're suggesting. Voss has men, weapons, money to hire more of both. He's not going to surrender his property without a fight that could destroy us all." "Those women aren't property," Emma replied with steel in her voice that could have cut glass. "They're human beings who deserve better than what they're getting. And if we don't help them, who will?" Catherine had arrived during their discussion, her teacher's instincts apparently sensing that something important was happening. She listened to Hart's report with growing anger that transformed her refined features into something formidable and dangerous. "I've been documenting unusual activity for months," she said, producing a leather-bound journal from her traveling bag. The book was filled with meticulous notes in her precise handwriting. Dates, times, wagon descriptions, even some license numbers I've managed to copy when they stopped for water. If we're going to act, we should at least do it with intelligence rather than just courage. Over the following hours, their informal council of war grew to include several other townspeople who'd noticed disturbing patterns but lacked the courage or knowledge to act independently. Tom Bradley, who ran the general store, had sold unusual quantities of rope and chains to men he didn't recognize. Sarah Martinez, whose husband worked for the railroad, reported freight cars being loaded and unloaded at odd hours with no corresponding paperwork. Most significantly, they were joined by a weathered man in his 50s who introduced himself simply as Smith and claimed to be a traveling horse trader. But something about his bearing, the way he carried himself, his careful attention to their discussion, and the way his experienced eyes cataloged every detail in the room suggested a very different background. "You folks are talking about taking on a dangerous operation, run by people who kill as easily as most men spit," Smith said once he'd heard their plans. His voice carried quiet authority that commanded immediate attention. "I hope you understand exactly what you're risking." "We understand the risks," Emma replied, meeting his assessing gaze directly without flinching. "But we also understand what happens if we do nothing while innocent women suffer and die." Smith studied her face for a long moment, noting the steel beneath the surface, the kind of strength that was forged in fire and cooled in blood. Then he nodded slowly, as if reaching some internal decision. "Fair enough. Mind if I offer some professional consultation? Then advice from someone who's been in similar situations." There was something about the man's demeanor that commanded respect. He spoke with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to making life-and-death decisions under impossible pressure, and his suggestions were both practical and sophisticated. First rule of any rescue operation: gather intelligence before you move so much as a finger. Know your enemy's strength, his routines, his weaknesses, his escape routes. Second rule: have multiple contingency plans and memorize them all. Third rule: never attempt rescue without backup that can reach you if everything goes sideways. Over the following days, they put Smith's advice into practice with growing efficiency. Hart volunteered to scout the mining operation more thoroughly, using his legitimate farming business as cover for rides that took him past Voss's facility. Catherine began documenting shift changes and guard rotations with a teacher's methodical precision. Pike prepared medical supplies and identified safe houses where rescued women could be treated and hidden from pursuit. Emma found herself becoming the unofficial coordinator of their efforts, her experience as a victim providing crucial insights into how such operations functioned. She understood the psychology of captivity, the methods used to break resistance, the subtle signs that indicated when prisoners might be moved or eliminated entirely. But as the days passed, she began to notice troubling inconsistencies in their intelligence gathering that made her skin crawl with familiar dread. Hart reported guard positions that didn't match Catherine's careful observations. His descriptions of the facility's layout seemed to change between conversations, sometimes subtly, sometimes dramatically. Most concerning, he asked detailed questions about their planned timing and approach routes that seemed to go well beyond mere curiosity or helpful concern. Emma tried to dismiss her growing suspicions as paranoia left over from her traumatic experience. Hart was a neighbor, a friend who'd volunteered to help despite obvious personal risks to himself and his children. But her instincts, sharpened by weeks of survival in Voss's custody, refused to be silenced by rational argument. The breaking point came on a warm April evening, when Hart arrived with urgent news that their window of opportunity was closing rapidly. He was slightly out of breath, as if he'd ridden hard, and his hands shook as he delivered information that could mean the difference between success and catastrophe. Saw them loading wagons this afternoon. He reported, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the evening's moderate temperature. Looks like they're planning to move the women tomorrow night, maybe the night after at the latest. If we're going to act, it has to be soon, or we'll lose them forever. Emma watched Hart's face as he delivered this crucial intelligence, noting the nervous energy that seemed at odds with his usual steady demeanor. His eyes wouldn't quite meet anyone else's directly, and he kept glancing toward the door, as if expecting unwelcome visitors. "How many wagons did you observe?" Chato asked with professional thoroughness. "2, maybe 3. Hard to tell from my position without getting close enough to be spotted." Hart wiped his hands on his pants, leaving damp streaks. "But definitely enough capacity to transport multiple prisoners and their guards." After Hart left to return to his own farm, Emma found herself alone with Chato as they cleaned up from dinner. The girls had gone to bed early, exhausted from a day of helping with spring planting that had left them all covered in honest dirt. "Something's wrong," Emma said quietly, her voice barely audible above the crackling fire that provided their only light. Chato looked up from the rifle he was cleaning in preparation for tomorrow's planned operation. "Wrong in what way?" "Hart's story doesn't add up to anything that makes sense. He said he saw them loading wagons this afternoon, but Catherine was watching from the schoolhouse all day and didn't report any unusual activity. His description of guard positions keeps changing every time he tells it. And tonight, he asked specific questions about our approach route that seemed..." She trailed off, suddenly aware of how her suspicions must sound when spoken aloud. "You think he's lying to us?" Chato's voice was carefully neutral, but his hands had stilled on his weapon. "I think he's terrified. Maybe terrified enough to..." Emma couldn't finish the thought, couldn't give voice to the possibility that their trusted friend might be working for the very people they sought to oppose. Chato set down his rifle and studied Emma's face in the firelight, noting the tension in her features and the way her hands trembled slightly as she spoke. "What do your instincts tell you? Not your fears about betrayal. Not your gratitude for his friendship, but the part of you that survived Voss's operation when other women didn't make it out alive." Emma closed her eyes, reaching for the cold certainty that had kept her breathing during the darkest weeks of her captivity. When she opened them again, her voice was steady as granite. "My instincts say we're walking into a carefully prepared trap." They spent the rest of that sleepless night revising their plans, working out alternative approaches that didn't rely on Hart's increasingly suspect intelligence. It was agonizing to contemplate the possibility that their friend and neighbor might be betraying them. But Emma's survival instincts were too finely honed by recent experience to ignore. The next morning brought confirmation of her fears in the most direct and brutal way possible. Chato had ridden out before dawn to check their cattle, a routine that took him along several miles of creek bottom, where the animals liked to graze on sweet grass. Emma was preparing breakfast when she heard gunshots echoing across the valley. Too many shots fired too rapidly to be someone hunting for food. She sent the girls to hide in the root cellar with instructions not to emerge until either she or their father came for them. Personally grabbed the Winchester with hands that had grown steady through necessity, and ran toward the sound of gunfire with her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird. What she found when she reached the creek would haunt her dreams for the rest of her life. Chato lay motionless beside the water, blood seeping from a wound in his shoulder, while his horse stood nearby with reins tangled in some bushes. But he was alive, conscious, and alert enough to wave her back frantically when she started to run toward him with desperate abandon. "Stay down," he called, his voice weak, but urgent with command. "They're still out there waiting." Emma dropped behind a fallen cottonwood and tried to assess the tactical situation through eyes that wanted to fill with tears of rage and terror. 3 men on horseback were positioned along the creek's far bank, rifles ready and clearly waiting for movement from their wounded quarry. But what made her blood freeze in her veins was the identity of the man directing the ambush with calm authority. Lewis Hart sat his horse with grim purpose, pointing toward Chato's position, while giving instructions she couldn't hear but could easily imagine. The betrayal hit her like a physical blow to the stomach, driving the air from her lungs and leaving her gasping. Hart's steady, reliable heart, who'd shared their meals and played with their children, had led Chato into a carefully prepared killing ground. "Lewis?" Emma called out, her voice carrying across the water with desperate hope that she might be misunderstanding what she was seeing. "Lewis, what in God's name are you doing?" Hart turned in his saddle, and when their eyes met across the creek bottom, Emma saw shame and fear and desperate determination all mixed together in his weathered features, like ingredients in some terrible recipe. "I'm sorry, Emma," he called back, his voice heavy with anguish that seemed genuine despite his actions. "But some prices are just too high for a man with children to ignore." One of his companions fired a shot that splintered wood near Emma's head, making her duck lower behind her inadequate cover. When she looked up again, Hart was riding toward her position with his rifle drawn, his face set in lines of reluctant but absolute resolve. "Don't make this harder than it has to be," he said when he was close enough for normal conversation. His voice carried the same tone he'd used when comforting his own sons after nightmares. "Voss just wants to talk to you, Emma. Nobody else has to get hurt if you come peaceful." Emma laughed, a sound with no humor in it whatsoever, bitter as alkali water. "We both know that's the biggest lie ever told in this territory, Lewis. We both know exactly what Voss wants, and it's not conversation." Hart's face crumpled with what might have been genuine remorse and the expression of a man who'd sold his soul and was only now understanding the true cost. "My farm's mortgaged to the hilt, Emma. Drought killed most of my crops 2 years running, and the bank's going to foreclose next month. My boys would be orphans living on charity or worse." His voice broke slightly. "Voss offered to clear my debt completely, give me a fresh start in California with enough money to buy good land. I got children too, Emma. Had to think of them first." "How long?" Emma asked, though she already suspected the answer would destroy whatever remained of her faith in human decency. "How long have you been feeding information to Voss?" "Since the very beginning," Hart admitted, unable to meet her eyes as he spoke the words that condemned him. "Since the day you first started asking questions about missing women in town. Voss knew someone was poking around in his business, offered me more money than I'd see in 10 years of farming if I kept him informed about who was asking what questions." Emma felt pieces clicking into place with sickening clarity, like a puzzle revealing a picture too horrible to contemplate. Hart's detailed knowledge of their plans, his voluntary reconnaissance missions that had provided conveniently incomplete intelligence, his positioning during crucial moments of their developing strategy. He'd been steering them toward this moment from the very beginning, like a sheepdog driving livestock toward slaughter. "The supply run to town last month," Emma said, sudden understanding flooding through her like poison. "You knew Dan Reardon would be waiting in ambush." "Had to make it look real," Hart replied, genuine anguish audible in every word. "Take a bullet myself, gain your complete trust, Voss needed you to feel safe enough to start making bigger moves, planning operations he could anticipate and counter. Around them, the morning air carried sounds of approaching horses, more of Voss's men closing in to complete whatever operation Hart had helped arrange with such meticulous care. Emma could see Chato trying to reach better cover despite his wound, but the movement was slow and obviously painful. "What happens now?" Emma asked, though she already knew the answer with crystalline certainty. "Now you come with me peaceful-like, and maybe Chato lives long enough to see his daughters grow up into women." Hart's weapon remained trained on her, but his hands were shaking with either fear or remorse. Voss promised no unnecessary killing if everyone cooperated without making a fuss. "Voss lies as easily as he breathes," Emma said flatly. "We all know too much to live, Lewis, including you once you've served your purpose." Before Hart could respond to this uncomfortable truth, the sharp crack of a rifle shot echoed across the creek bottom from an entirely unexpected direction. One of Hart's companions pitched from his saddle with a scream that cut off abruptly, tumbling down the creek bank to crash onto the rocks below with final bone-breaking impact. "Federal Marshal," a powerful voice called from the ridge above them, carrying across the canyon with unmistakable authority. "Throw down your weapons and surrender immediately." Emma's heart stopped beating for what felt like an eternity. That voice, cutting through the morning air like a sword of righteousness, was hauntingly familiar despite years of separation and the changes that hardship could bring to a man's vocal cords. Hart spun in his saddle, searching desperately for the source of this new threat, and Emma took advantage of his distraction to roll toward better cover behind a cluster of boulders. From her new position, she could see a figure on the ridge, tall, lean, wearing a wide-brimmed hat and carrying himself with the natural authority of someone accustomed to command in the most desperate situations. Samuel Whitlow, Deputy U.S. Marshal. The figure called his words, carrying the full weight of federal law. This area is now by authority of the United States and subject to a federal court. Emma's breath caught in her throat like a physical thing. Samuel Whitlow. Her father's brother, the man who'd supposedly died in Apache country 3 years earlier, according to reports that had reached the orphanage. The uncle she'd barely remembered from childhood visits that had seemed like grand adventures at the time. Hart fired wildly toward the ridge, panic overtaking the careful control he'd maintained throughout their confrontation. His shot went wide by yards, but it prompted return fire from multiple positions. Marshal Whitlow had not come alone to this deadly party. In the confusion that followed, Emma managed to reach Chato's position through a combination of desperate courage and incredible luck. His shoulder wound was serious, but not immediately life-threatening, the bullet having passed through muscle without hitting bone or major blood vessels that would have meant rapid death. "Can you ride?" she asked, helping him apply pressure to the wound with strips torn from her petticoat. "Better than I can walk or fight," he replied through gritted teeth, his face pale but his eyes still alert. But Emma, that voice calling from the ridge. "I know exactly who it is." She interrupted, her own voice tight with emotions she couldn't begin to sort through. "It's my Uncle Samuel. It's my uncle. My father's brother, supposedly dead for 3 years, but apparently very much alive." Gunfire continued from multiple directions, as Voss's men found themselves caught between Marshal Whitlow's party pressing from above and their intended victims, who had suddenly become much more dangerous than anticipated. Hart was shouting orders that no one seemed to be following his carefully planned ambush, dissolving into chaos as federal authorities pressed their attack from superior positions with superior firepower. Emma helped Chato to his feet and began working their way toward where his horse waited with the patience of an animal trained for dangerous situations. The horse was nervous but uninjured, and with considerable effort, they managed to get Chato into the saddle despite his wound, and the bullets still flying around them like deadly insects. "There." Hart's voice cut through the gunfire with desperate intensity. They're trying to escape. Don't let them reach the ridge. But his remaining companion was already spurring his horse toward distant hills, apparently deciding that survival outweighed whatever payment Voss had promised for this operation. Hart found himself essentially alone, surrounded by federal marshals closing in from 3 directions with professional efficiency. Lewis Hart, Marshal Whitlow's voice, carried absolute authority that brooked no argument. Drop your weapons immediately and surrender. You're under arrest for conspiracy kidnapping and assault on federal officers. Hart looked around desperately, perhaps finally understanding that Voss's promises of protection were worthless when federal law became involved with deadly seriousness. His rifle clattered to the ground, followed by a pistol Emma hadn't known he was carrying. As the marshals took Hart into custody with efficient professionalism, Emma found herself face to face with a man she'd last seen when she was barely 7 years old. Samuel Whitlow was older now, his hair silvered by years and his face marked by the kind of lines that came from making hard decisions under impossible pressure. But his eyes were unmistakably the same shade of blue as her own, and they filled with tears when he saw her clearly. "Emma Rose Whitlow," he said quietly, his voice breaking slightly on her name, like a prayer answered after years of desperate petition. "Lord Almighty, child, I've been looking for you for 3 long years, following every rumor and chasing every shadow." Emma felt tears streaming down her cheeks as she fell into his embrace, feeling pieces of her broken past finally clicking into place, like a puzzle that had been missing crucial elements. "Uncle Samuel, but everyone said you were dead, killed by Apaches near the Colorado border. Had to let people think that," he replied, his own voice thick with emotion, barely held in check. "Only way I could investigate your father's murder without alerting the people responsible that someone was still asking dangerous questions." The word murder hit Emma like a physical blow, stopping her breath in her lungs. "Murder. But I was told Papa died in a mine accident, a cave-in, that your father was Deputy U.S. Marshal Thomas Whitlow," Samuel said gently, his words reshaping her entire understanding of her own history. "He was investigating territorial corruption, specifically kidnapping and the unlawful transport of women operations when they killed him. You were supposed to die in that same attack, but somehow you survived and ended up in that orphanage where Voss's people eventually found you." Emma stared at her uncle, trying to process information that rearranged her entire sense of identity, like an earthquake reshaping familiar landscape. Her father hadn't been a simple miner, struggling to make an honest living. He'd been a federal marshal fighting the same corruption that had eventually enslaved her. The attack on our homestead. She whispered, memories suddenly clicking into terrible focus, like pieces of a nightmare puzzle. They said it was random violence bandits looking for easy money, but you were the only survivor, and within days you'd been placed in Voss's custody through entirely legal channels. Samuel's eyes were hard with long-suppressed rage that had been carefully banked for 3 years. "Took me this long to piece together what really happened to understand that my brother's daughter was alive and being held by the same people who murdered him." Dr. Pike had arrived during their reunion, his medical bag at the ready, to treat Chatto's wound with professional competence. As he worked with practiced efficiency, Emma found herself caught between overwhelming relief at her uncle's survival and growing understanding of how vast and well-organized Voss's corruption network truly was. "How did you find us here?" she asked Samuel, still struggling to believe he was real and not some desperate hallucination born of hope and terror. "Been tracking Voss's operation for months, following freight movements and financial records through 3 territories. When Hart started reporting regularly to his handlers about a young woman matching your description, I knew we were finally close to something important." Samuel's expression darkened with professional anger. What I didn't expect was to find you planning your own rescue operation with a handful of brave civilians. We couldn't wait for official help that might never come. Emma explained, feeling defensive about their amateur efforts. Those women in the mines, they're exactly where I was 6 months ago. Terrified alone, praying that someone somewhere will care enough to help them before it's too late. Samuel studied her face with growing understanding, noting the steel that had replaced childhood's innocence, the kind of strength that was forged in suffering and tempered in survival. Your father would have been proud of the woman you've become, he said quietly. You've got his sense of justice, his willingness to risk everything for people who can't protect themselves. As Pike finished treating Chado's wound with bandages that would hold until they could reach proper medical facilities, their attention turned to the larger problem that had brought them all together in this deadly convergence. The women Hart had reported seeing were still trapped in Voss's mining operation, and the failed ambush would only make their captors more desperate and dangerous. How many men does Voss have at the mining facility? Samuel asked Hart, who sat in handcuffs with the defeated posture of someone whose world had collapsed around him. Hart's face was gray, with the realization that cooperation was his only hope for any kind of mercy, either legal or divine. Maybe 15 plus Voss himself. He came up from Santa Fe 2 days ago, said this operation was too important to trust to subordinates who might make mistakes. Emma felt her pulse quicken with something that might have been anticipation or terror, probably both. Cornelius Voss, the man who'd orchestrated her father's murder, her own enslavement, and the suffering of countless other women, was finally within reach of the justice that had been so long delayed. What's the facility's layout? Samuel continued his professional interrogation. Old silver mine with processing buildings constructed on top of the original diggings. Hart replied, his voice hollow with defeat and shame. Main office where they keep all the records and conduct business bunkhouse for guards, and a separate building where they hold the women they're preparing for transport. Emma closed her eyes, remembering her own captivity in similar facilities scattered across the territory. The fear that never left, the desperation that grew stronger each day, the gradual erosion of hope as rescue seemed increasingly impossible. We're going to need a very careful plan, Samuel said, studying notes one of his deputies had made during Hart's confession. This isn't just about rescue anymore, it's about gathering evidence to bring down Voss's entire network all the way to the top. Over the following hours, they developed a strategy that balanced the urgent need to save the captive women with the longer-term goal of ensuring justice through proper legal channels that couldn't be corrupted or subverted. Samuel's federal authority provided legitimacy their previous amateur efforts had lacked. But the basic challenge remained unchanged, penetrating a fortified position defended by desperate men who had everything to lose and nothing left to restrain them. Emma found herself serving as tactical advisor, her unique experience providing insights that no amount of law enforcement training could duplicate. She understood the psychology of captivity, the methods used to control prisoners, and the subtle signs that indicated when captives might be moved or eliminated entirely to prevent them from testifying. Most importantly, she understood Voss himself, his calculating nature that treated human beings like inventory. His willingness to sacrifice subordinates to protect himself, his absolute conviction that money and influence made him untouchable by conventional law. As evening approached with the promise of darkness that would both conceal their approach and increase its dangers, they made their final preparations. Emma had insisted on participating, despite Samuel's obvious reluctance to put his newly found niece in danger again. "I'm not asking for permission," she said, when he tried to convince her to remain behind with the wounded Chado. "Those women need someone who understands what they've been through, someone who can help them trust that rescue is real and not just another form of elaborate torment." Samuel studied her face, seeing determination that reminded him powerfully of his murdered brother, the same willingness to sacrifice personal safety for abstract principles of justice. Finally, he nodded with reluctant acceptance. "You stay close to me at all times," he said, his voice carrying the full weight of command. "Whatever happens up there, we stick together like we're joined at the hip. I didn't find you after 3 years of searching just to lose you in the first battle." The approach to Voss's mining operation took them through country that Emma remembered from her worst nightmares, Red Rock Canyons, where sound echoed deceptively scattered juniper that provided minimal cover and alkali dust that got into everything, despite their efforts to move quietly through terrain that seemed designed to betray intruders. They reached their observation position just as the sun was setting behind western mountains, painting the landscape in shades of gold and crimson that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. From their vantage point on a ridge above the mine, they could see the entire facility spread below them like a detailed diagram of organized evil. The main office building was larger than Hart had indicated, with multiple windows showing lamplight as evening deepened into full darkness. Guard positions were exactly where he'd described them, but Emma counted more men than he'd reported, at least 18, possibly more, moving in the shadows. Most chilling was the separate building he'd mentioned, windows barred like a prison, and only one visible door that was certainly locked and heavily guarded. Through one window, Emma thought she glimpsed movement that might have been women, but the distance and failing light made certainty impossible. "There," Samuel pointed toward a cluster of horses near the main building, their expensive tack gleaming in the lamplight. Voss's personal mount, that bay with a silver-trimmed saddle worth more than most men earn in a year. He's definitely here, probably conducting business. Emma felt cold rage settle in her stomach at the sight of fury so pure it transcended mere anger and became something almost spiritual in its intensity. Cornelius Voss, the man who destroyed so many lives for profit, was less than 300 yards away. All the suffering, all the fear, all the broken families, it all traced back to his greed and complete absence of human compassion. "Remember," Samuel said quietly to his 3 deputies' men, whose faces were hard with professional determination. "Voss needs to be taken alive, if at all possible. We need his testimony to unravel the entire network, identify customers and suppliers, and anyone else involved in this abomination." As full darkness settled over the mining camp like a suffocating blanket, they began their descent toward the facility. The plan was necessarily complex, simultaneous approaches from 3 directions, with Emma and Samuel responsible for reaching the captive women, while the deputies secured the main building and prevented escape or the destruction of crucial evidence. Everything depended on timing, stealth, and the desperate hope that Hart's information about guard positions was accurate, despite his betrayal in every other matter that counted. They were halfway down the treacherous slope when the first complication arose, the sound of approaching horses from the main road, too many horses moving too purposefully to be coincidental traffic. "Reinforcements," Samuel whispered grimly, his voice barely audible above the night wind. Someone must have gotten word to Voss that we were coming despite our precautions. Emma felt her heart sink as she counted the riders entering the camp below with military precision. At least 10 men, all armed with rifles and sidearms, all riding with the purposeful determination of professionals responding to a well-planned crisis. Their rescue operation had just become exponentially more dangerous, the odds shifting from merely terrible to almost certainly suicidal. But there was no turning back now, not with innocent women trapped in that hellish place below. They had tonight, or those women might not have another chance at freedom before they disappeared forever into the vast criminal networks that stretched across the continent. Emma checked her rifle one final time, noting how steady her hands had become, and followed her uncle toward whatever waited in the darkness below. The approach to the barred building took them through a treacherous maze of abandoned mining equipment that provided excellent cover, but also created numerous opportunities for deadly surprises. Emma found herself relying on skills she'd developed during her own escape, moving silently across loose stone, reading shadows for potential threats, trusting instincts sharpened by weeks of survival under impossible conditions. Samuel moved beside her with the fluid grace of someone who'd spent years tracking dangerous men through hostile country, where a single mistake meant death. His presence was reassuring, but Emma couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into something far worse than they'd anticipated. The first guard was positioned exactly where Hart had predicted, but he was alert and nervous in a way that suggested recent instructions to watch for specific types of trouble. Samuel approached from behind with knife drawn, moving like death itself, but the man turned at the last second and opened his mouth to shout a warning that would bring the entire camp down on them. Emma's rifle spoke before conscious thought could intervene, the bullet taking the guard center mass and dropping him with barely a sound beyond the wet thud of impact. She worked the bolt action automatically, chambering another round, while scanning for additional threats, with eyes that had grown accustomed to violence. "Clean shooting," Samuel whispered, but his eyes showed concern at how readily his niece had resorted to lethal force without apparent hesitation. They reached the building's barred window without further incident, and Emma felt her heart break at what she saw inside. 4 women huddled on rough benches, all showing signs of the systematic brutalization she remembered too well from her own captivity. One was heavily pregnant, her condition making her especially valuable to certain customers with specific perversions. Another looked barely past childhood with pale skin and clothing that suggested recent immigration from a Europe that probably seemed like paradise compared to this. But it was the third woman who made Emma's breath catch with sudden recognition. Despite gray hair and lines of suffering etched deep by recent hardship, the face was unmistakably familiar. From her own brief stay in Voss's custody, Greta Hoffman, who'd been captured while traveling to California to join family members. Emma tapped gently on the window bars, trying to get attention without alarming the captives, who might not recognize rescue when it appeared. When Greta looked up, recognition flashed across her features, followed immediately by desperate hope that was almost painful to witness. "Emma." Greta's voice was barely audible through the glass, hoarse from disuse and despair. "Emma, is that really you, or am I dreaming again?" "Federal marshals," Emma whispered back urgently. "We're here to get you out of this place. Is there a guard inside with you?" "One man with a shotgun by the door. He's been drinking steadily, but he's still dangerous as a cornered rattlesnake." Greta's voice carried the controlled desperation of someone who'd been waiting for rescue while trying not to hope too much, because hope could be more painful than despair. Samuel had located the building's single door and was examining the heavy lock that secured it with professional interest. "Need explosives to get through this quickly," he muttered under his breath, "or someone with the right keys." As if summoned by his words, boots scraped on gravel nearby, and a voice called out with drunken authority that carried clearly in the still air. "Hey, who's skulking around out there, Jake, that you checking the perimeter?" A figure emerged from shadow tall thin, wearing a badge that caught moonlight like a piece of tarnished silver. Emma recognized him immediately as Sheriff Collier from Riven Oak, the man who'd consistently ignored reports of missing women and shown no interest in investigating Voss's obviously criminal activities. "Marshal Whitlow." Collier continued, his voice slurring slightly from alcohol. "You're making a serious mistake here, friend. This is a legitimate business operation, properly licensed and operating within territorial law." Samuel stepped into the light, his own badge gleaming with federal authority and his rifle trained on Collier's chest with deadly precision. "Sheriff Collier, how interesting to find you here so far from your legal jurisdiction. Care to explain your presence?" Collier's face went pale as fresh snow as he realized the scope of what he'd walked into the careful house of cards collapsing around him. That is, Mr. Voss requested consultation on security matters related to his mining operations. Mr. Voss requested corruption services. Samuel interrupted with cold precision. You're under arrest for conspiracy, bribery, and obstruction of federal justice. But Collier's arrival had alerted the entire facility to their presence with the efficiency of a church bell. Shouts erupted from multiple directions as guards scrambled to respond to an attack they'd been warned might come. Rifle shots cracked through the night air as Samuel's deputies engaged targets near the main building muzzle flashes, lighting the darkness like deadly fireflies. The keys. Emma called to Collier, who was fumbling for his own weapon despite Samuel's rifle trained on his chest with unwavering precision. Where are the keys to this building? Go straight to hell. Collier snarled, finally clearing leather with his pistol, despite his intoxicated condition. Emma shot him without hesitation or remorse, the bullet spinning him around and dropping him to the ground with a crash that echoed off surrounding buildings. She rolled his body over and found a ring of keys in his vest pocket, her hands shaking with adrenaline and the terrible satisfaction of justice served. The largest key fit the building's lock perfectly. Emma yanked the door open and found herself face to face with the interior guard, a man she recognized as One-Eyed Sam Mackenzie from her own captivity. His shotgun was already swinging toward her when Samuel's rifle spoke from behind, dropping Sam instantly with professional efficiency. "Move everyone out now," Samuel commanded with absolute authority. "Federal marshals, you're safe." The captive women stumbled toward freedom with the desperate haste of people who'd given up hope of ever seeing daylight again. Greta helped the pregnant woman, while Emma guided the youngest victim, whose legs were shaking too badly to support her weight reliably. But their escape route was rapidly closing as Voss's reinforcements moved to cut off retreat toward the ridge with military precision. Muzzle flashes erupted from multiple positions, bullets whining off stone and metal with deadly persistence, some coming close enough that Emma could feel their passage like whispers of death. "This way." Samuel pointed toward a cluster of processing buildings that might provide temporary cover from the withering crossfire. "Stay low and keep moving. Don't stop for anything." They ran through a gauntlet of hostile fire, the rescued women stumbling and falling, but somehow finding strength to continue when survival itself was at stake. Emma found herself supporting two of them simultaneously, while returning fire at targets she could barely see in the darkness, muscle memory from weeks of practice guiding her actions. Behind them, the barred building erupted in flames as someone decided that destroying evidence was more important than preserving the facility. Orange light danced across the mining camp, creating shifting shadows that made accurate shooting nearly impossible for both sides while illuminating their desperate flight. They reached temporary shelter behind an ore crusher, just as a new voice cut through the chaos with unmistakable authority that commanded immediate attention from everyone present. "Enough." Cornelius Voss emerged from the main building like a king surveying his domain, his expensive clothing incongruous in the industrial setting, but his presence commanding immediate attention from subordinates who knew better than to disobey. "Marshal Whitlow, I believe we have matters of mutual interest to discuss." Samuel pushed Emma and the rescued women deeper into cover, while keeping his rifle trained on the shadowy figure who'd orchestrated so much suffering for so many innocent people. "Cornelius Voss." Samuel called back with the full weight of federal authority. "You're under arrest for murder, kidnapping, and the unlawful transport of women and conspiracy against the United States government." Voss laughed a sound with no humor in it whatsoever, cold as winter wind across tombstones. "Federal authority ends where practical reality begins, Marshal. You're outnumbered, outgunned, and completely surrounded. Perhaps we should negotiate terms that allow everyone to walk away from this unfortunate misunderstanding with their lives intact. The only negotiation, Samuel replied with steel in his voice, is whether you surrender peacefully or we carry you out in a pine box. Emma watched this exchange while trying to help the traumatized women understand that rescue was real, not just another form of elaborate torment designed to break their spirits. But her attention kept returning to Voss himself, and the man who destroyed her family, enslaved her, and caused unspeakable suffering to countless others over the years. She dreamed of this moment during the darkest days of her captivity, imagined confronting the architect of so much evil with her own hands. Now that it was actually happening, she felt surprisingly calm, as if all the fear and rage had crystallized into cold, precise purpose. "Voss," she called out, stepping into the flickering light where he could see her clearly. "Do you remember me?" Silence fell over the mining camp as Voss studied her face, recognition dawning slowly like sunrise over familiar landscape. "Emma Rose Whitlow," he said finally, his voice carrying grudging respect mixed with genuine surprise. "Thomas Whitlow's little girl, all grown up and considerably more dangerous than I anticipated. I should have killed you when I had the chance, shouldn't I?" "Yes," Emma agreed with simple honesty. "You should have." But instead of raising her rifle immediately, she took a step closer, her voice carrying clearly in the sudden quiet. "My father was Deputy U.S., was Deputy Marshal Thomas Whitlow. You had him murdered to protect this operation, and you tried to kill me too. But I survived, and now I'm here to see justice done." Voss's expression shifted, becoming something uglier and more dangerous. "Justice? You want to talk about justice, little girl? Your father was a fool who couldn't understand the natural order of things. Some people are born to rule, others to serve. He tried to upset that balance. He tried to protect innocent people from monsters like you." "Innocent?" Voss laughed again, the sound even colder than before. "The women I move are goods merchandise products for a market that demands them. Your precious father couldn't understand business, couldn't see the larger economic forces at work." Emma felt something break inside her at his casual dehumanization of the women he destroyed. They're human beings, with names and families and dreams. Their inventory with expiration dates. Voss interrupted with brutal honesty. "And speaking of expiration dates, yours is approaching rapidly. But I'm prepared to make you an offer, Miss Whitlow. Join my organization, voluntarily use your obvious intelligence to help improve efficiency, and I'll guarantee the safety of that Apache and his half-breed children you've grown so attached to." The threat to Chato and the girls hit Emma like a physical blow, revealing the true scope of Voss's knowledge about her new life. He'd been watching, gathering information, preparing leverage to use against her. "Touch them and You'll what?" Voss smiled with predatory satisfaction. "I have men watching your precious homestead right now. A single word from me, and they burn it to the ground with everyone inside. The choice is yours, Miss Whitlow. Cooperate or watch everything you care about turn to ash." Emma realized with crystalline clarity that this moment would define not just her own fate, but the fate of everyone she'd learned to love. Voss was offering her the same devil's bargain that had trapped so many others, compromise with evil to protect what mattered most. But Emma had learned something during her captivity that Voss didn't understand. Sometimes the only way to protect what you love is to be willing to sacrifice everything for it. "I have a counteroffer," she said quietly, raising her rifle with steady hands. "You surrender now, and maybe you live long enough to stand trial. Or," Voss asked, still confident in his position, or I put you down like the rabid dog you are." For a moment that stretched like eternity, they faced each other across the firelit clearing, the young woman who'd survived hell and the man who'd created it for profit. Around them, the battle had paused, as if everyone present understood they were witnessing something significant. Then Voss made his mistake. He reached for the weapon at his side, apparently believing Emma wouldn't have the courage to pull the trigger when it mattered most. Emma fired a single, carefully placed shot that took Cornelius Voss in the right shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him to the ground with a grunt of surprise and pain. The bullet had been positioned precisely disabling, but not immediately fatal, ensuring he would live to face justice in a federal courtroom. The psychological effect on his remaining men was immediate and devastating. Their leader was down, federal marshals controlled key positions, and the women they'd been guarding were already free. Resistance collapsed as guards began throwing down their weapons and calling for mercy. In the sudden quiet that followed, Emma knelt beside Voss's bleeding form and spoke in a voice only he could hear, words that carried the weight of absolute finality. "You're going to live, Cornelius Voss. You're going to stand trial for every life you've destroyed, every family you've broken, every woman you've sold like cattle. And when you die alone in prison, forgotten by everyone except your victims, justice will finally be served for my father and all the others." Voss tried to speak, blood frothing on his lips, but Emma was already walking away. She had no interest in his last words, his excuses, or his attempts to bargain for mercy he'd never shown others. The aftermath moved with the swift efficiency of federal law enforcement, finally allowed to operate without local interference or corruption. Samuel's deputies secured the scene while wagons were summoned to transport Voss and his surviving associates to territorial prison for medical treatment before trial. The rescued women were taken to Dr. Pike's clinic in Riven Oak, where they would receive medical care and assistance in contacting family members or finding safe places to rebuild their shattered lives. Emma found herself serving as translator and matron attendant, helping them understand that their nightmare was finally over. But the most significant moment came when Samuel presented Emma with a badge that gleamed silver in the morning sunlight, its surface polished to mirror brightness. "This belonged to your father," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "Deputy U.S. Marshal Thomas Whitlow, killed in the line of duty while investigating territorial corruption. I've carried it for 3 years, hoping someday to return it to his family where it belongs." Emma took the badge with trembling hands, feeling the weight of her father's sacrifice and legacy pressing against her palm like a sacred trust. "I'm not qualified to be a federal marshal, Uncle Samuel. I'm just a woman who survived something terrible." "Pooty, you're the woman who survived Voss's operation, escaped against impossible odds, and organized the rescue of 4 other victims while gathering evidence that will destroy his entire network." Samuel's voice carried quiet pride that warmed Emma's heart. "The territorial governor has authorized me to offer you a position as special deputy, a deputized civilian aide to the U.S. Marshal, working directly with my office to investigate kidnapping and the unlawful transport of women across territorial lines operations." Emma looked at the badge, then at Chato, who was watching from nearby with his arm in a sling and eyes full of love and pride. Beyond him, she could see Alope and Dateste playing in the morning sunshine, secure in the knowledge that their family was safe and permanent. "What would the job involve?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer. "Helping other women who've survived similar experiences. Training law enforcement officers to recognize trafficking operations and work effectively with traumatized victims. Testifying in federal court to ensure people like Voss face appropriate justice." Samuel paused, studying her face. "The territory needs someone who understands both sides of this fight, the victims and the system that's supposed to protect them." Emma pinned her father's badge to her dress, feeling its weight settle against her heart like a promise finally kept. I accept on one condition. My jurisdiction includes this area, and my family stays together no matter what." "Wouldn't have it any other way," Samuel said with a smile that reminded her powerfully of her father. 1 year later, Emma Rose Whitlow stood on the porch of her expanded homestead, watching the sunset paint Thunder Creek Valley in shades of gold and crimson, while Chatto worked with their growing herd of cattle in the distance. The brass ring on her finger caught the dying light symbol of promises made and kept during a simple ceremony that had united two broken people into something stronger than either could have been alone. Alope, now 9 years old, and showing signs of the remarkable woman she would become, was teaching her younger sister to braid rope, while both girls chattered about their plans for the next school term. Da Teste still carried her corn-husk doll everywhere, but it was now accompanied by wooden animals Chatto had carved and a collection of books Emma had ordered from St. Louis. The settlement that had grown around their homestead now boasted nearly 100 residents drawn by the promise of federal protection and the example of people who'd stood up to organized evil and won. Dr. Pike had expanded his clinic into a full hospital. Catherine Dale's school served children from 3 counties. Even Lewis Hart, after serving his sentence and making what amends he could, had returned to honest farming, with a reputation partially restored by his ultimate cooperation in bringing criminals to justice. Emma's work as Special Deputy Sworn Civilian Aide had taken her throughout the territory and beyond, helping other law enforcement agencies recognize and combat trafficking operations, training officers to work effectively with traumatized victims, and ensuring that the legal system treated survivors with dignity rather than suspicion. But it was the quiet moments that meant the most evenings, like this one, sitting on the porch with Chatto and the girls while the desert wind carried the scent of sage and possibility across a land that had tested them all and found them worthy of the peace they'd claimed. As the first stars appeared over the high desert country, a lone rider approached their homestead from the direction of town. Emma recognized the horse and its rider, young Sarah Martinez, who worked part-time at Dr. Pike's clinic and had volunteered to help with Emma's expanding network of safe houses for trafficking survivors. But something about Sarah's posture, the urgency of her approach, suggested this wasn't a routine visit. Emma felt familiar alertness, return the combat awareness that never entirely left her, despite months of peaceful living. "Mrs. Chatto," Sarah called as she dismounted using the name Emma had taken upon marriage. "There's a woman at the clinic, young, maybe 16, Spanish-speaking. She's terrified and injured, says men are chasing her. Dr. Pike thought you should know immediately." Emma looked at Chatto, seeing understanding pass between them without words. Their peaceful evening was about to end, duty calling them back to the ongoing battle against human predators who saw vulnerable people as opportunities for profit. "Well, how badly injured?" Emma asked, already mentally preparing for what might be needed. "Cuts and bruises, signs of mistreatment, but nothing life-threatening. Dr. Pike's tending her wounds now. But Mrs. Chatto, she keeps asking for La Marshall specifically. Says someone told her to find the woman Marshall who helps girls like her." Emma felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders, but it was accompanied by something new pride that her reputation for helping survivors had spread beyond territorial borders. Somewhere in the darkness, another young woman had heard that help existed and found courage to seek it. "Saddle my horse," she told Chatto, who was already moving toward the barn. "Girls, you know the routine? Inside the house bar, the door don't open it for anyone except me or your father." As they prepared to ride toward town, and another case that would test their skills and courage, Emma touched her father's badge and felt the continuous thread connecting past, present, and future. Each woman she helped carried forward the legacy of justice her father had died protecting. The desert wind that had once carried her toward terror and captivity now brought the scent of sage and renewal, whispering stories of survival and redemption, across a land where good people still fought to protect the innocent from those who would prey upon them.